She said, "Crying won't help you here?" Then she shut the door. I remember the sound of the latch more than the words. A soft final click like something sealing shut. I sat there cross-legged on the splintered floor of the upstairs bedroom, trying not to let the tears fall too loudly. You learn early which sounds are allowed. Laughter had to be quiet, crying was a threat, and silence that was safe. It was late autumn when my father left me on the steps of my grandmother's farm. He said it was just for a while, said he had things to sort out after the divorce. I wanted to believe that meant weeks, maybe a few months. But the look in his eyes, distant, distracted already elsewhere, told the truth. My mouth was too afraid to form. Grandma took me in without warmth. Not cruel at first, just cold like a stove that hadn't been lit in years. She laid out the rules that first night: no backtalk, no wasting food, and no crying over things you couldn't fix. When I asked where I should put my suitcase, she pointed to the attic stairs and said, "There." I opened the Bible that night, the one Mom left me, a slim red-ribboned thing worn soft at the edges. Inside, tucked between Psalms and Proverbs, were her recipe cards, faded handwriting, little oil stains from our kitchen back in the city. That was the last place I'd felt safe. Every night after I'd read one like a prayer, "Cherry cobbler, 1-2 cup sugar, your fingers in the dough soft as clouds." She used to hum when she cooked. I hummed in secret now. No one asked me if I was okay. No one wondered why I barely spoke. I became background, quiet, careful, because sometimes the only way to survive a house like that is to make yourself invisible. And I was very good at disappearing. I learned to stop reaching for hugs before I learned long division. The first time I truly understood I was not wanted, I was 8. It was a Wednesday, I remember, because we'd had dried meatloaf for the 3rd day in a row. And Grandma always said, "Waste not, want not," like that. Excuse the stiffness in the meat or the silence around the table. I had drawn a picture that day at school, a crayon house with a tall tree and a girl standing on a swing. I had even written for Grandma in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny hope, maybe, that if I gave a piece of myself, I might be seen. I left it on the table right next to her newspaper and lukewarm coffee mug. That evening when I went to check, it was gone. Not hung on the fridge, not tucked in a drawer. I found it later torn wet, lining the bottom of the kitchen trash. My chest had gone hollow in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't ask her about it. I didn't say a word. That was the beginning of the quiet agreements I made with myself to feel less, to need less. I stopped offering drawings after that. Stopped telling anyone at school what my life felt like. One of the cousins, Marcy, saw me staring too long at the trash that day. She smirked. "That's ugly anyway. No one wants baby scribbles." I nodded, pretended to agree. I was already learning the language of self-erasure. The only place I kept drawing after that was in the margins of Mom's recipe cards. Little leaf stars, crooked smiles that weren't brave enough to be mouths. No one noticed, but that's what made it safe. In our family, love was earned, and I never made the cut. My grandmother believed in hard work and withheld affection. She wore her pride like armor and wielded discipline like a broomstick. Her house smelled of starch and vinegar and judgment. You could feel it settle in your bones after just a week. She used to say children these days don't know how to be useful. I was 8 then, 9 then, 10, learning to scrub floors with vinegar and carry firewood with hands too small for the load. But I never complained. Not once. Because I thought if I did enough, if I was enough, she'd soften. She didn't. The cousins Marcy and Luke were older, sharper. They had learned early how to echo Grandma's tone, how to twist a look into a wound. They'd mock my quiet voice, call me city girl, or worse, Mama's ghost. They said it like it was a weakness, like remembering my mother was an embarrassment I hadn't outgrown. I remember once Marcy cornered me in the barn and said, "Crying your mother must have taught you that," before she left. Then she walked away laughing while I stood in the smell of hay and old wood and shame. Grandma didn't stop them. I think she thought it would toughen me. Her eyes held no malice, just the hard stare of someone who believed pain built character. I was not a child to her, I was a lesson. My father called sometimes, once every few months. I used to count the days then, the weeks, until I stopped. He always said just a little longer. I stopped asking what that meant. I told myself I was lucky to have a roof, lucky to be fed, But luck shouldn't taste like fear every morning. And I think deep down I started believing maybe they were right, that I was too soft, too quiet, too full of feeling for this family. There were 100 moments I could have spoken, and I swallowed every one. There was the time Luke shoved me into the fence post and said it was an accident. The time Marcy dumped milk over my journal and laughed when I cried. The time Grandma told the pastor's wife I was too dreamy to be of any use. Each time something rose in my chest, a spark of protest, a flicker of, this isn't right, and each time I buried it. Not out of fear exactly, but because I believed love meant staying loyal even when it hurt, even when it silenced you. I told myself if I just stayed still, if I didn't make things worse, they'd eventually see me. That loyalty would be louder than their cruelty. But silence, I learned, doesn't earn you love. It only teaches them how to hurt you without consequence. There were nights I'd hold the Bible in my lap and pretend my mother was reading over my shoulder. I'd trace her handwriting on the cards. She always ended her recipes with a note bake until golden serve warm with love. Don't forget the cinnamon, it matters. One card had no recipe at all, just a line written in faded ink. When it hurts, don't become hard, become more whole. I didn't understand what that meant at the time. I thought being whole meant being accepted, being loved. But I never spoke those thoughts aloud. Not to Grandma, not to the cousins, not even to my father when he finally called on my 11th birthday, forgot how old I was, and said he'd make it up to me. I just smiled into the phone and said, it's okay. It wasn't. But I was already fluent in pretending it was. Some wounds don't scream, they whisper over and over until you believe them. Every morning was a rehearsal in invisibility. I'd wake before dawn, slip into the kitchen to set the table, sweep the ashes from the stove, fold the dish towels just right. No one asked me to. No one thanked me either. But doing it made the silence feel less cruel. Breakfast was a quiet war zone. Grandma sipped her coffee with eyes that missed nothing, and the cousins played their little games snickering. If I dropped a fork, rolling their eyes, if I said, please. Once Luke salted my porridge when I wasn't looking. When I spit it out, Grandma said, don't be dramatic. It's just food. They chipped away at me in small, precise ways. Not enough to leave bruises, just enough to leave doubt. And that's the thing about slow cruelty. It makes you wonder if you're imagining it. If maybe you are too sensitive. If maybe, just maybe you deserve it. I kept myself busy, helped in the garden, learned how to mend seams, how to scrub with lye soap until my knuckles burned. They called it chores. I called it survival. At school, I wore the same cardigan all winter. Marcy had new coats every year. When I asked if I could use my savings for one, Grandma looked at me like I'd asked to fly to Paris. Your arms ain't broken. Sew the holes. So I did, with uneven stitches and quiet shame. But every time I came home, I still checked the mailbox. Still waited for a letter from my father, a birthday card, something to say I hadn't been forgotten. Most days it was empty, so I'd open Mom's Bible again. Her card for blueberry pie always made me feel warm inside. Best served when someone needs a little light, she wrote. No one served me pie in that house, but reading her words felt like borrowing sunlight, even just for a moment. The day they laughed at me in church was the day something broke quietly, but forever. It was the Easter potluck. Everyone dressed in their stiffest clothes, pretending the pews had softened their hearts. Grandma had made her usual casserole with too much salt and too little joy. I offered to bring something just once, a peach tart using one of Mom's old recipes. I stayed up late, carefully rolling the crust, folding in the fruit like prayer. I even tied the box with string. When we arrived, I carried it in like it mattered, like maybe it would show them I belonged. Marcy saw it first. You bake now, she sneered. What is this, a sympathy pie? Before I could answer, Luke swooped in, untied the string, lifted the tart high, and tilted it to check the bottom. It slipped from his hands and hit the church steps with a sickening thud. Peaches and crust smeared across the concrete like something wounded. Everyone stared. Then someone laughed. I don't know who started it, but once it began, it caught like wildfire. Even adults, even Grandma. She shook her head and muttered, waste of good fruit. I didn't cry. Not in front of them. I knelt down, picked up the ruined crust with shaking fingers, and packed it back into the box. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I didn't speak. I went to the attic, opened the Bible, and ran my hand over the empty page next to the recipe. There had been something in me, Something soft, still believing I could prove myself with kindness. It died on those steps. But even as I lay in bed that night, hollow and sore, I heard Mom's voice in my head. Don't let the world make you hard. You're more than how they see you. I wasn't sure I believed her anymore, but I held the Bible tighter anyway. I wrote the truth once, and then I buried it under my bed. It was just a spiral notebook, cheap with a frayed red cover. I bought it with money I earned pulling weeds for the neighbor's goats. I told myself it was for school notes, but I knew better. I needed somewhere to put the words I couldn't say aloud. The first page was simple. I don't think they love me here. Seeing it written in ink made my heart race. It felt like betrayal, not of them, but of the story I'd been telling myself, that I was lucky, that this was better than nothing, that if I was quiet and useful and obedient, someone would eventually choose me. I wrote in that notebook every night after that. Just a few lines. Not poetry, not beautiful. Just truth. Grandma looked at me like I was a broken gate today. Luke took my coat and wore it in the snow while laughing. Marcy said my mother must have left because she couldn't stand the sound of my voice. Some nights I wrote about Mom, how she used to let me dance in the kitchen while music played low, how she smelled like cinnamon and rosemary, how she kissed the top of my head like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't know where she was. Dad never said. But in those pages, I let her exist. I let her hold me again. One night I wrote, I think I'm starting to disappear. Not from the world, just from myself. And then I closed the notebook and slid it under the loose floorboard near the window. No one ever found it. No one ever looked. But somehow writing it down made the pain less like a secret and more like a witness. Even if the only one listening was me. The day the Bible went missing, it felt like losing her all over again. It was a Saturday in spring. I'd come back from the garden with dirt still under my nails, a small bruise on my shin from slipping near the chicken coop. I went upstairs like I always did, the attic steps creaking in their familiar rhythm. But the Bible Mom's Bible wasn't where I left it. I searched the corners, the shelf, the space beneath the cot. Nothing, just dust and the smell of old wood and something hollow blooming in my chest. I asked Grandma, careful with my tone. She didn't even glance up from her crossword. It was falling apart. I tossed it. You're not a child anymore. Just like that. No pause, no apology, no understanding of what she'd done. I stood there stunned. Not just by the loss of a book, but by what it meant. That she could take the one thing I had left of my mother and reduce it to trash. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands in my lap. I'd known deep down that she didn't value softness. But this was different. This was erasure. I found the recipe cards a few days later in the burn pile. Half-charred edges curled like they were ashamed to exist. I pulled them out, held them to my chest like they were still warm. Most were gone. The peach tart, the blueberry pie, even the one that said, "Don't forget the cinnamon." One had survived barely legible. When it hurts, don't become hard, become more whole. I don't know why I didn't cry. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe the grief had folded itself into something deeper, something quiet, something final. That night I didn't write in the notebook. I just stared at the ceiling and thought, this is what it feels like when hope runs out. I left, no one noticed. I turned 23 in silence. No cake, no call, just the usual chores and another meal I cooked alone. That night I packed a small bag. Not the kind you slam shut in anger, but the kind you zip slowly, like closing a chapter. A few clothes, the notebook, the last surviving recipe card. I stood in the kitchen for a while before I left. The counters gleamed the way they always did, not out of care, but out of control. Cleanliness is proof of order. Grandma sat in her chair by the window knitting something beige. She didn't look up when I passed, didn't ask where I was going. I didn't tell her. I walked past the barn, past the empty mailbox, past the spot on the church steps where my tart had fallen all those years ago. No one called out. No one followed. The wind was cold but not cruel. At the edge of the gravel road, I paused and looked back at the house. Not for permission, not even for memory. Just to see if it looked smaller now that I wasn't inside it. It did. I carried no revenge in my heart. Only space. For the ache, yes, but also for something more. Something I didn't yet know how to name. On the bus out of town, I held the recipe card in my palm like a compass. Become more whole, it read. And for the first time, I believed I still could, even without them, especially without them. I don't want them to hurt. I just want to stop hurting. That's the difference now. Back then, I thought healing meant being seen, being chosen, being welcomed into the arms that once rejected me. But I've learned that peace doesn't require their apology. I live in a small apartment now, quiet and sunlit. There are plants on the windowsill and a secondhand oven that hums when it warms up. On Sundays, I bake. Not for anyone else, just for me. Sometimes I still hear her voice, Grandma's sharp tone, Marcy's cruel laughter, the heavy silence of my father on the line. But they echo from a distance now like storms that passed and never returned. I found a Bible at a thrift store last week. Not the same, of course. But inside I placed the last surviving card. It's wrinkled and smoke-stained, the ink fading at the edges. Still the words are there. When it hurts, don't become hard, become more whole. I read it aloud sometimes. Just to hear it. Just to believe it more. Forgiveness, I've found, isn't about letting them back in. It's about not carrying their weight anymore. About refusing to shape your life around someone else's lack of love. I won't write them letters. I won't seek revenge. I won't waste years hoping they change. I'll bake pies and hang my own drawings on the fridge. I'll sit with my pain, name it gently, then let it rest. And when people ask me what happened back then, I just smile and say, I grew up in a house where softness was seen as weakness. But I am soft, and I am still here. And that in itself is a kind of victory.